Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Glenski, Chief Inspector with the Board of Pharmacy, and welcome to our webinar today. Today we have Inspector Katie Diebold going to give us an update on the sterile compounding rule. Before I turn it over to Katie, I'll just go through a few of our introductory slides here. If you've not been on our webinar before, you're in listen-only mode. If you have any trouble getting audio via your computer, there is an option to use a phone call on your GoToWebinar toolbar. It tells you the dial-in instructions if you need to do that. You will get 1 hour of CE for doing this webinar today. You must be logged in to GoToWebinar. If you're not officially signed in to GoToWebinar, you will not get CE. I'll go over more instructions at the end of the webinar, and remember to save your certificates that we mail out to you. We have handouts available for today's webinars. For those, yesterday we emailed them out to all those that were registered. If you didn't get them, you can find them on our website under upcoming events page. We do record all our webinars, so if you want to watch any of our past ones, you can go to the board's website under publications and resources and watch them. At the end, if we have time, we will take questions from our participants. If you want to submit a question during the webinar, just go to your GoToWebinar toolbar and type in your question and hit send, and we will get to them at the end if we have time. So now I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Like Tom said, I am Katie Diebold. I'm an inspector with the Missouri Board of Pharmacy. I mostly inspect sterile compounding pharmacies, so those of you that have Class H on your license, you've probably seen me out and about. If not, I'm probably eventually will work my way to see you. So today I will be providing an update regarding some changes that were recently made to the Missouri Board of Pharmacy sterile compounding regulations. So like I said, we'll be talking about the emergency amendment that was recently made to section 2.200 sterile compounding. We'll also be reviewing environmental sampling, and then if there's time, we will answer questions. So today I'll be talking about the board's regulations and requirements, and then also some recommendations that are related to these topics. So we'll go ahead and get started with reviewing the changes that were made via emergency amendment to the sterile compounding rule. So within the sterile compounding rule, there were two sections that were amended based upon comments that were made by the public. So those two sections are section 9, which is aseptic technique and preparation, which changes the in-use time for nuclear pharmacies. And then section 20 was amended, which is remedial investigations. So the board felt that these two areas needed to be amended via emergency rule in order for our pharmacies to continue to provide quality sterile compounding services and to ensure the continued availability and supply of radiopharmaceuticals. So these were effective August 30th, 2018. All of the other sections of the sterile compounding rule remain unchanged. So no changes in facilities, garbing, cleaning, anything else, just these two sections. The amendment can be found by following this website, and I believe it's also been posted on the board's website. So we'll go ahead and start with the changes to section 9, which was aseptic technique and preparation, which includes the addition of the following language regarding in-use times. So for multiple dose vials and containers with no antimicrobial preservative used in the preparation of radiopharmaceuticals whose beyond use dates are 24 hours or less, the in-use time shall not exceed 24 hours. So this basically extends the in-use time for nuclear pharmacies. So just a reminder of what an in-use time is. It is the date and time before which a product must be used after it has been opened or punctured with a needle. So a lot of times pharmacies will utilize containers that contain enough drug for multiple preparations. So they'll puncture a container and then save it for later use. So the in-use time is how long that specific container can be saved and used for other compounded preparations. So in the nuclear world, they'll make radioactive kits which contain numerous doses, and then they will draw up syringes to send out to different hospitals and people that are in need of the nuclear services. So the in-use time is different than the beyond use date. Beyond use date is the date and time after which a compounded preparation shall not be used. So the beyond use date is assigned to your final compounded preparation, whereas an in-use time is assigned to components that are being used during the compounding process. And these components are never leaving the pharmacy, they're staying there. So that is the in-use time as compared to the beyond use date. So compounding in nuclear pharmacies is obviously a little bit different and unique compared to our other sterile compounding sites. And this is because they're working with radioactive products. So the production of these nuclear radiopharmaceutical kits, if they were to be limited to 6 hours, that could potentially reduce the availability and supply of the nuclear compounds across Missouri, especially those that are located in rural areas. So that is why the in-use time was extended to 24 hours for those containers that are used in compounding radiopharmaceuticals. And that's basically to prevent interruptions of nuclear pharmacy services across the state. So the in-use time for all other containers or pharmacies remains unchanged. So I'll review what those requirements are. For single-dose vials and containers, in pharmacy bulk containers, you have to assign an in-use time no longer than 6 hours after the initial needle puncture. And the 6 hours comes from studies that were performed, which shows that that's about the amount of time that it takes for a microorganism after it's introduced into a container to begin replicating and potentially becoming a danger to the patient. For multiple dose vials or containers that have an antimicrobial preservative, you can use those for up to 28 days after the initial needle puncture. And these two times are the maximum in-use times to assign when you don't have any information from the manufacturer. So it is important to review the manufacturer recommendations because they could be shorter, in which case you would have to assign the shorter in-use time, or they could be longer and you could go ahead and extend that in-use time if you have that information from the manufacturer. To find that information, it's usually in the package insert or on the container itself. So, and then just a reminder that ampules must never be stored for any amount of time. For Section 20, remedial investigations, the board decided to amend this section due to numerous public comments that were received, which indicated that the requirement to stop compounding during a remedial investigation was significantly impacting patient care because sterile compounding services were being interrupted. So, in light of that, the entire section was rewritten. The main changes are changes to when a remedial investigation must be performed. There's also an allowance for pharmacies to continue compounding during investigations if certain criteria are met. And there are also changes made to the notification requirements. So we'll go ahead and do a brief overview of the changes compared to the previous rule, and we'll go into more detail as we go along. So the previous rule required pharmacies to do a remedial investigation when sampling demonstrated a colony forming unit, or CFU, count that exceeds USP Chapter 797 action levels. The previous rule also required a highly pathogenic microorganism if it was detected in any ISO-classified area, regardless of the number, so even just one would trigger a remedial investigation. Now, the emergency amendment, which was effective August 30th, 2018, now requires a remedial investigation to be performed if sampling demonstrated a CFU count that exceeds USP Chapter 797 action levels. So the highly pathogenic microorganism language was removed. The next area is when a pharmacy has to stop compounding. So the previous rule required that pharmacies were required to stop compounding when remedial investigations were performed in ISO Class 5 or ISO 7 areas. And now with the emergency amendment, pharmacies may continue to compound during a remedial investigation if certain criteria are met, and we'll review what those are. And the last area of change was notifications. So pharmacies were previously required to notify the board within 7 days if a highly pathogenic microorganism was detected. And now pharmacies are required to notify the board within 3 days, but only if a resample that's collected during the investigation exceeds USP 797 action levels. So any remedial investigation that was initiated prior to August 30th of 2018 does need to be conducted according to the previous rule. And then anything that kind of happens after that, you can go ahead and follow the emergency amendment procedures. So since remedial investigation deals a lot with environmental sampling, I thought this would be a good time to go over some environmental sampling practices. So what is environmental sampling and why is it so important? Environmental sampling is the sampling of the air and surfaces for viable microorganisms, so things like bacteria and fungus. So we're not referring to the monitoring of non-viable airborne particles here. So non-viable particles are used to measure the performance of our engineering controls, which are producing the different levels of air cleanliness for us. So things like ISO classified areas, so ISO 5, 7, and 8 areas, that's all measured via particle counts. Instead, and those are non-viable. Instead, with environmental sampling, we are referring to living, viable microorganisms that may be present in the environment. So this sampling allows pharmacies to monitor their compounding areas for contamination. And the reason that we are monitoring our environments is because our compounding areas are not completely sterile. Instead, they are controlled environments in which the pharmacy is trying to maintain or limit the number of microorganisms. So conducting routine sampling of the environment allows pharmacies to demonstrate to themselves and to regulators that they are able to maintain a microbial state of control. Overall, environmental monitoring is a great feedback tool that shows that your pharmacy is able to maintain contamination control through cleaning and disinfection and work practices. And all of this together ensures that we are providing a compounding environment that is safe for our patients. So the board's requirements for environmental sampling are listed here, and it differs based upon your risk level. So risk level 1 pharmacies, you are required to perform volumetric air sampling conducted in all ISO classified areas every 6 months. And you'll notice here it says volumetric, so that means you have to use an electronic air sampling device. So you place an agar plate kind of on the top of that. It pulls in typically 1,000 liters of air across that agar plate, and then it's incubated and read at a later time. So you cannot use settling plates as your sole source of the air sampling. Some people will use those in addition to, but you need to, for a minimum requirement, use the volumetric air sampling. For risk level 2, you are required to perform volumetric air sampling in all ISO classified areas every 6 months. And you're also required to conduct surface sampling in all ISO classified areas every 6 months as well. For risk level 3, volumetric air sampling again must be conducted in all ISO classified areas every 6 months. And the requirement for surface sampling is more frequent here. It should be done every 30 days for all ISO classified areas. So keep in mind that these are the minimum requirements. You can always conduct more sampling, and in fact, we recommend it. So for an example would be risk level 1. You can see here on this slide that risk level 1 pharmacies are not required to conduct surface sampling. However, it's still recommended because surface sampling is important, mostly because touch contamination can be a common source of compounded sterile preparation contamination. So if the surfaces are contaminated and your compounders are touching them, they may inadvertently contaminate a CSP. So that's why it's important to monitor those surface samples as well. The more frequent sampling also provides more constant feedback and allows you to establish what's normal for your pharmacy. So you can establish kind of an initial bioburden. Once that's determined, you can monitor for trends and you can take action right as the issues arise. When you're only sampling every 6 months, if you had a contamination shortly after that, you could potentially have a contamination problem for 5 more months and you wouldn't even necessarily discover that until your next sampling comes up. So definitely recommend to do more frequent sampling. So some environmental sampling practices. Where should you sample? How many samples should you collect? So the board's regulations require that you take at least 1 sample within each ISO classified area. So for example, if you're compounding in a risk level 1, type setting where you have an ISO 5 primary engineering control and it's just in a controlled area, so there aren't any HEPA filters to provide an ISO 7 buffer area. So you would only have the one ISO classified area, which would be your hood. So you'd be required to take one air sample in that ISO 5 area. Whereas with a risk level 2, if you have the type of setup where you have maybe 2 ISO 5 hoods and then those are placed within an ISO 7 room, that would be a total of 3 samples because you'd have one in each ISO 5 area and then one in the ISO 7 area. And going back to those controlled areas that might not have the secondary engineering controls in place, it's usually not super helpful to take samples in those controlled areas that don't have an ISO classified specification, and that's because there aren't any secondary engineering controls there to help control contamination. So you would expect to see a lot of growth, and I don't know that you would really do anything differently in those scenarios. We recommend, however, going above and beyond that one sample per ISO classified area and sample numerous locations within each ISO classified area. You should pay attention to areas that are prone to contamination. So look at your pharmacy, do an assessment, and develop an environmental sampling plan. You should incorporate things like carts, staging areas, gowning areas, things like that. And then surface samples, when you're collecting them, are best collected at the end of a shift or a workday, and it really gives you a true representation if your employees are cleaning and doing the best work practices at the end of the day. As far as who should perform the sampling, it can be done by either the pharmacy or by a certifier or outside company. If it is performed by the pharmacy, there will be some costs up front involved to doing your own sampling. You'll of course have to buy your equipment, so you'll have to buy the sampler. You'll have to purchase all the materials that go along with that. You'll also have to train your employees about how to do the sampling, and then the amount of time that your employees are taking to do the environmental sampling might be an issue as well. Some benefits, however, is that if the pharmacy is doing your own sampling, you have more control over the procedures. You can develop when you want to sample and how often, and you are able to ensure that your employees are trained properly to do the environmental sampling. You have more overview of the whole process. A lot of times employees are more invested when they are doing their own environmental sampling because they can see a direct feedback loop of, hey, if we clean more often, our environmental sampling plates look better. So that can be a benefit to have your employees be more invested in your sterile compounding. And I think one of the biggest benefits is a quick turnaround time for resamples. So if you do have some out of specifications and you need to take some resamples, you don't have to call and make an appointment. You can just go in there, collect your resamples. You don't have to wait a week or more. You have all of that control in your hands. If you do decide to use a certifier or an outside vendor, it is important to talk to your certifier about what their procedures look like. And ideally, this should be done prior to the samples being out of specification. This isn't something that you really want to run into problems with as you're kind of in the stress and panic of possibly having to do a remedial investigation. So ideally, talk to your certifiers ahead of time, ask them about the proper training. Have their employees been trained how to collect samples correctly? What sort of procedures are they going to use? Do they know and they should be cleaning and disinfecting any equipment they bring into your pharmacy? What type of media are they using? How do they incubate it? Are they going to incubate it themselves? Do they use an outside lab? Most importantly, you'll want to figure out how does the certifier handle out of specification results. Will they call or email you? Will you have to wait like 2 to 4 weeks before you get that report? All of this is important information to find out ahead of time. And then also you could ask your certifiers how quick can they do resamples. So these would all be things to consider when you are having your certifier do your sampling for you. As far as the type of media to use, you can use general growth medium such as tryptic soy agar or soybean casein digest agar. And if you are using media for surface samples, you want to make sure that they contain neutralizers to inactivate any cleaning agent residues. So those neutralizers are oftentimes lecithin and polysorbate 80. So what those do is it, like I said, neutralizes any cleaning agent that could be picked up on the plate. So if you didn't have those neutralizers there, the cleaning agent might actually prevent any microorganisms from growing, which kind of defeats the purpose. You would have a false negative there. So if having those neutralizers allows the microorganisms to grow. When you're collecting surface samples, you can use contact plates or swabs if it's kind of a difficult to collect area. And typically those are convex plates. And then for air sampling, they're usually the typical concave type of plates. You can also use a media to support fungal growth, such as malt extract agar or Sabrod dextrose agar. You can also you also want to make sure to review your media before you use it, and there are different things you want to be looking for. Expiration dates, you want to make sure you're not using expired media. You want to ensure that it was stored properly, so you want to make sure that if the media requires refrigeration, that that's being done, that a box wasn't left out on the shipping dock for 2 nights and things like that. You want to inspect the media itself for contamination. You want to make sure that it's not contaminated before you start sampling your pharmacy. Also look at the media itself. If it's too thin or dry, the microorganisms might not be able to adhere to those surfaces, and you wouldn't have a good result there. It's also a good idea to record the lot number of the media that you're using, so that way if there are any problems with your media, you can share that information with the manufacturer and they can perform their own investigation. So each lot of media should be accompanied by a certificate of analysis. The certificate of analysis is important because it shows that the manufacturer has performed the proper quality control testing of the lot prior to the release. So the certificate of analysis will show what contents or ingredients are in the media. It shows that they did growth promotion studies, which is very important since that's kind of the main purpose of the media, is to promote microorganism growth. So you want to make sure that that was completed. It states that they made the media at the proper pH, that it's the right color, and that also that it was produced in a sterile manner, because you don't want that media to be contaminated by the time you get it. So these are all important things to look for. So once you've collected your samples, you will then incubate and interpret the results. So you can do the incubation by yourself at your pharmacy if you have an incubator, or you can send to a lab, or again, you can use your certifier. If you do want to use an outside vendor, either a lab or a certifier, you'll want to, again, talk to them regarding their procedures, how quickly they'll notify you of growth, how they're incubating, that sort of thing. So if you're doing it yourself, you would invert those tryptic soy agar plates. It's important to invert those so that if any condensation collects within the plate, it doesn't drip down and potentially skew your CFU results. So you want to go ahead and invert those and incubate the plates for 30 to 35 degrees Celsius for 48 to 72 hours. If you're using the fungal media, you would incubate at 26 to 30 degrees for 5 to 7 days. And then you can also do a 2-stage incubation, which is an option. So you can incubate at 30 to 35 degrees for 2 days, and then at 20 to 25 for 5 additional days. So that provides an environment for all types of microorganisms to grow. If you have an action level exceeded at that point, you would then perform an investigation. And I just want to talk about beware of repeated 0 CFU findings across the board. So if you have repeated sampling that is always 0 all across the board every single month, it might be something to be suspicious of. So we should expect to see some growth in our environment because, like I said earlier, it's not necessarily a sterile area. There's a lot of people coming in and out, materials, equipment, particle generation type activities are occurring in there, and all of those would result in some microorganisms. So the presence of all zeros could indicate false negatives. So it's a good idea to do some investigations, to do an assessment to assure that everything's being done correctly. So questions you might ask is, maybe there's a problem with the media, maybe a different kind was inadvertently ordered. Maybe it's not being incubated at the right temperature, or maybe the storage conditions weren't met prior to you using it. So maybe it was left out of the refrigerator for a week if it required refrigeration. Or maybe for some reason, it's just not promoting growth. So you could incorporate some positive controls where you potentially contaminate a sample to see that the media is actually capable of growing. Or maybe you need to assess the sample collection procedure. So maybe the air sampler is randomly turning off in the middle of your sampling. These would all be things to investigate and kind of question and review if you have repeated zero CFU findings across the board. All of these practices that I talked about today should be included within a detailed policy and procedure. And the policy and procedure should be detailed enough that anyone reviewing those would easily be able to recreate those environmental sampling procedures. So back to our remedial investigation rule, emergency amendment. When is a remedial investigation required? So a remedial investigation is required if any environmental monitoring sample demonstrates a colony forming unit or CFU count that exceeds USP Chapter 797 action levels. So the 797 action levels are the number of CFUs in which some sort of action needs to be taken to remediate the contamination. So those action levels are listed here below. So for the air samples, you would count the number of CFUs per 1,000 liters that were drawn on just one plate. And for an ISO class 5 area, if the CFU counts are greater than 1, that requires an investigation. For an ISO class 7 area, anything greater than 10 would require a remedial investigation. And for ISO class 8 or worse, anything greater than 100. For the surface samples, you'll want to count the number of CFUs per plate. So it's not the number of CFUs total, it's just for one individual plate. For an ISO class 5 area, anything greater than 3 would trigger a remedial investigation. And then for ISO class 7, anything greater than 5. And for ISO class 8 or worse, anything greater than 100 would trigger a remedial investigation. And as I mentioned earlier, you are no longer required to do an investigation for highly pathogenic microorganisms. The board removed this due to the fact that really any microorganism could be pathogenic depending on the patient. So if you have an immunosuppressed patient or the route of administration, so in sterile compound, a lot of times it is intravenous, could be something like intrathecal, where there isn't a very good immune or any immune response there. So any microorganism could potentially be pathogenic depending on the patient or the route. So now the focus is on the 797 action levels and exceeding those. So you've collected your sample, you've exceeded action levels. What comes next? What do you do next? So initially you'll want to quarantine the affected area if applicable. For example, if you have an ISO class 5 hood in a facility that also has other ISO classified hoods, you would probably just want to quarantine that specific hood and just use your other hoods while you're doing your investigation. However, it's sometimes tricky to quarantine an entire room, for example, if you had an ISO 7 room that exceeded action levels. So in those cases, you are now able to continue compounding while you perform the investigation, and we'll talk about what those criteria look like in order to be able to do that. Next, you're going to identify potential sources of the microorganisms. So the board does not require that you identify the microorganisms that you get back from your sampling, but it can be helpful in determining the source of the microorganisms and to help establish a bioburden and then potentially monitor for trends. So for example, say you decide to do monthly sampling and you routinely have maybe 2 CFUs of fungus. And then this next month, for whatever reason, it jumps up to 8. So now you would be on alert because this is kind of out of the norm for your pharmacy. So then you could start evaluating practices and taking action before your action levels are actually exceeded and they go out of specification. So that is one benefit to doing routine identification of microorganisms, even though it's not required. Next, you will take corrective action. You will then resample the affected areas. And it's a good idea, well you have to actually document the events of your remedial investigation. So you want to keep a record of all the corrective actions that were taken, including the resampling results. So it's helpful to have a timeline of what exactly happened when. So it's a good idea to record what happened on what date, what actions, when the resamples were taken, when you received the results, etc. Some pharmacies develop a document that walks them through step by step of what is needed during that investigation, or some sort of corrective action, preventative action plan. And those, I think, are very helpful. In a time of panic or stress, it's helpful to have that already laid out for you. So it's a good idea to develop that ahead of time, so that if you do have anything come out of spec, you have a plan in place and you're not scrambling around. So if you do decide to go ahead and identify those microorganisms, you can also use that to help you determine potential sources of where those microorganisms are coming from. So this is not an exhaustive list here, but it kind of gives you a good idea of what to look for. So the most common type of microorganism that is recovered from environmental sampling is typically gram-positive cocci, and that's because they are living on humans in many numbers. So you'll see Staph aureus, Staph epidermidis, micrococcus are pretty common. So if you have a spike in any of these, it's probably from your personnel. Maybe they're not garbing correctly. Gram-positive rods, you'll see bacillus, and oftentimes they can produce spores. So the spores are often brought in by dust or dirt, so they're usually entering via shoes, maybe the wheels on a cart. Materials and equipment oftentimes have spores on them. So maybe your employees aren't spraying and wiping down their materials very well, and that wiping action is what helps to get rid of those spores. So that could be an important indication that maybe that's not being done. If you find gram-negative rods like E. coli, Salmonella, Pseudomonas, those are often associated with a water source. So maybe take a look for maybe there's a leak somewhere from the air conditioner that's above you, or something like that, or maybe there is maybe the sample was just collected really close to the sink or something like that. Molds and yeast are very common in our environments. Aspergillus, Penicillium, Cladosporium, Candida. Alternaria is another common one that you'll see. And these are often coming from unfiltered air. So in negative pressure areas, that maybe one area that you prepare chemo in, for example, if they are too negative, they will start to draw in air from places other than through your HEPA filters. So if you have ceiling tiles that aren't sealed correctly, or maybe you have outlets or holes or cracks, it will be pulling air through those, and it's unfiltered at that time. So then you might have a spike in mold or yeast in your room from those types of situations. Mold from their clothing, it's often outside in the environment, so people come inside and then they come in to do their sterile compounding. They might have mold on their clothing. It likes to hang out in cardboard, so hopefully you don't have any cardboard in your controlled or buffer area, but maybe someone was breaking down boxes before they came in to do sterile compounding, so that would be something to investigate. Oftentimes mold or yeast is associated with water, and then personnel, since they are living on our skin. Diphtheroids and Corynebacteria are often associated with sweating, so if you're having a problem with those organisms, it could be a sign that you need to adjust your AC. As all of us know, once you get all that garb on and you're moving around, it does get pretty warm, so that could be a sign that you need to adjust your AC for your employees. So areas to investigate and the corresponding corrective actions are listed here. These aren't in necessarily any order. But we'll start off with evaluating your cleaning agents and practices. So you want to make sure that you're using the correct cleaning agents. Are they appropriate for your environment? Do they have the required added detergent for the cleaning step? Maybe you need to switch to a different fungicidal. Maybe the fungicidal that you're using does not cover the type of fungus that is normally found in your environment. Or maybe you're having a lot of problems with spores. Maybe you need to incorporate a sporicidal into your cleaning routine. You also want to evaluate whether the cleaning agents are being used appropriately. Are the employees using the recommended contact time? So the contact time is the amount of time that it takes for a disinfectant to pass through the cell layer of the microorganism and provide that killing action. So maybe your employees are just quickly spraying and wiping it down. They're not letting the cleaning agent dwell for long enough. Maybe they are doing improper dilutions, or maybe it's a ready-to-use product and someone thought that they needed to dilute it. So having a cleaning product that is too dilute or maybe too concentrated could also affect its ability to kill the microorganisms. You should also evaluate the cleaning procedures that your employees are taking out. So are the proper cleaning activities occurring at the proper frequency? Maybe the floors are being cleaned every other day instead of the required daily task. Or maybe that it is being done daily, but that just isn't enough for your environment. Maybe you need to increase that up to twice a day. Might need to change the cleaning to occur more often than what the minimum standards are. You'll also want to evaluate that your employees are using the appropriate materials. Maybe they're going out to the main pharmacy and grabbing the mop that is used in the general pharmacy area, and they're bringing that into your cleaning into your controlled area without wiping it down. They should be using a mop that is dedicated to the controlled or buffer area. Maybe they're using gauze or something that's very particle shedding. That could be a source of microorganisms. Also evaluate how they're cleaning. Maybe they're not cleaning cleanest to dirtiest. Maybe they are cleaning the floor and then cleaning the hood, and then they're dragging that contamination into the hood. So these would all be things to evaluate when it comes to cleaning. Corrective action, and this is going to be a corrective action that you want to perform on any remedial investigation, is a thorough cleaning. You want to make sure that you correct the contamination problem through that action to start off with. You may need to change your cleaning products and procedures like we talked about, and then you may need to retrain your personnel. You want to evaluate your personnel and their operations, so specifically garbing. If you have an increase in micrococcus, for example, that's an indication that there's a problem with garbing. So maybe it's not being worn. Maybe one of your employees is just forgetting to put their hair cover on every day. Or maybe they get hot and they're pulling their mask down and their whole face is exposed. A lot of times we'll see that the wrists get exposed during compounding. So if the glove cuff isn't long enough and the gown starts to creep up, there'll be an area of exposed skin, and then that could be a source of contamination in your hood. Maybe your employees are continuing to compound with torn gloves because maybe they tore their glove and they don't feel like changing it. So these would all be things that you would assess related to garbing. For aseptic technique and material handling, you would want to assess that all items are being cleaned or disinfected appropriately prior to entering your controlled or buffer area. So like I mentioned earlier, an increase in spores could mean that maybe that's not being done. So corrective actions for those types of things are usually going to involve retraining your personnel. And sometimes maybe you just need to reassess everyone's competencies and re-perform those competencies to make sure that everyone understands what's required of them. And then if there is any retraining, to make sure they understand what the new standards will be. Next, you will evaluate your equipment. So primary and secondary engineering controls are the main pieces of equipment that are used in sterile compounding to help provide a safe environment for compounding. So we want to make sure that those items are working, that they're operational. And this might include working with your certifier to get some of these issues handled or even identified. So you'll want to check your pressures. You want to check air changes per hour, leaks in your HEPA filters, that sort of thing. We've seen air handlers being turned off at night. So maybe your HVAC system needs to be reassessed, and are they always kept on? If they aren't, what's being done to help remedy those contamination issues there? So corrective action would be replacement or repair of equipment, and then potentially recertification if you do replace or repair something. You'll want to evaluate your facilities. So go ahead and do an inspection of the room itself. Look for leaks, cracks, holes, things that could be a source of contamination. Exposed drywall often can become saturated by the cleaning products, and then it provides a place for microorganisms to grow. Particle shedding items, corrective action would be to make those repairs within your room and then possibly remove some of those particle shedding items. Typically, the less stuff that's in your room, the better it'll be in terms of you have less cleaning to do, less places for the microorganisms to kind of settle on. You want to evaluate the proper sampling procedures. So whether it's your own employees performing the sampling or the certifier, you'll want to evaluate that the proper sampling procedure was performed. And this would be especially true if something is very different than normal. So maybe you routinely have 2 CFUs and then this time you have 30 plus, then that might question whether the sampling was done correctly. And then corrective action for that is to retrain the personnel that are performing the sampling. So remedial investigations are sometimes tricky in that there may not really be a clear answer as to what went wrong, but you still take the corrective action where you think it's needed, and then you kind of let the resamples and the continued environmental monitoring be the feedback that you need to show you that those corrective actions were effective in maintaining the contamination. So the next big question is, am I required to stop compounding during the investigation? The answer is maybe. So the amendment does allow pharmacies to continue compounding during the remedial investigation if they meet certain criteria, and those criteria differ depending upon the affected ISO classified area. And so the pharmacy may choose to quarantine that area, or they can choose to continue compounding after completing the following. So for some pharmacies that do have larger facilities, they may just decide to quarantine that one area, for example, an ISO 5 hood, and use their other ISO 5 hoods that they have in the same area and utilize that equipment. But that might be a little harder if you only have one ISO 5 hood, and it might be harder for you to just quarantine that right out. So then this is what you would do in that instance. So in an ISO 5 area, if the sample is taken from an ISO 5 classified area that exceeds USP 797 action levels, the pharmacy must cease compounding in that area until resampling shows a suitable state of microbial control. However, a pharmacy may continue to compound during the investigation if they do the 3 following things. So the affected area is cleaned and disinfected by using a germicidal cleaning agent, a sporicidal agent, and then follow that with sterile alcohol. You'll need to change your beyond use states. So the maximum beyond use state assigned cannot exceed 12 hours, and this is temporary just during your remedial investigation. And then the affected area is resampled under dynamic conditions. So once your resamples come back, you can then go back to your normal beyond use states. So if the resample does come back though and your action levels are exceeded again, you are required to stop compounding in that area at that time, because obviously whatever corrective actions were taken at that time were not sufficient. It didn't fix the problem and you need to do some further digging. For an ISO 7 buffer area, and a reminder of what a buffer area is the area in which your primary engineering control is physically located. So if the sample is taken from an ISO 7 classified buffer area and it exceeds USP 797 action levels, you are required to stop compounding in that area until resampling shows a suitable state of microbial control. However, a pharmacy may continue to compound during the investigation if they do the 3 following things. The affected area is cleaned and disinfected by using a germicidal cleaning agent and a sporicidal agent, and then you change your beyond use states temporarily for your preparations that were compounded in that area. So for risk level 1 preparations, you cannot exceed 24 hours. Or if you're compounding a risk level 2 or risk level 3 preparation, you cannot assign a beyond use state. It has to be limited to just 12 hours. And then you'll need to resample that affected area under dynamic conditions. So the resampling in these cases, if you have 2 consecutive resamples that exceed action levels during that investigation, at that point you have to stop compounding in that area, because again, whatever corrective action you're taking is not fixing the problem at that point. For an ISO 7 anti-area or an ISO 8 anti-area, just a reminder, our regulation doesn't require anti-areas, but a lot of people have them and you're still required to sample them. If you do have an action level exceeded in either an ISO 7 or ISO 8 anti-area, then the pharmacy is allowed to continue compounding during the remedial investigation. You're still required to investigate that sampling, take corrective action, and then resample the area until you have passing results. So in terms of when you are required to notify the board, so the pharmacy is required to notify the board whenever a resample that is collected during the remedial investigation has exceeded USP 797 action levels. So you don't have to notify us when the remedial investigation is initiated. You're only required to notify us if a resample that has failed during that remedial investigation, then that's when you would notify us. So I'll give an example here. So you've done your sampling, you get a exceeded action level in your ISO 5 hood, you do your remedial investigation, you collect a resample, and that resample fails for a second time. Then you would notify us at that point that you have a failed resample. And when I say a failed resample, that means that the action level has exceeded, or the CFU count has exceeded those USP 797 action levels. So these notifications must occur within 3 days of the sample results. The notification should include details surrounding the remedial investigation, any sampling results you've collected so far, and then any corrective actions that are taken or that you plan to take. So you may not have all of this information up front, or the actions haven't been completed up front, and that's okay. You still just make the notification, you let us know what you have done so far, and then we'll follow up as the investigation progresses, and you'll kind of tell us what happened, what you did, what samples you took, and that sort of thing. So the notifications may be emailed to katie.diebold@pr.mo.gov. This is the preferred route of communication. It's a lot quicker and more straightforward. You can also mail them to the board office, but there's usually a delay there, and it's just preferred to email them straight to me. So that concludes today's webinar, and we will go ahead and take some questions.
Okay, thanks, Katie. We got some questions coming in. Let's see. Do I have to collect resamples in all ISO classified areas or only in the area that failed? So I assume they're talking about during a remedial investigation.
Yeah, so you are only required to collect resamples in the ISO classified area that failed. So an example would be you have a typical clean room suite, you have an ISO 8 anti area, you have an ISO 7 buffer area, and then you also have an ISO 5 hood in there. So say the hood failed and you take your corrective action, you collect, and then you're ready to collect your resamples. You wouldn't have to do all 3 areas. You would only need to collect a resample in the area that failed. So that would just be your ISO 5 area. You wouldn't have to take a sample in either of those other rooms.
Okay, what would you recommend if you believe a sampling error was made by the person collecting the sample?
So if you think there's a sampling error made by the person that collected the sample, unfortunately, there's no way to really prove that that was the case. So you're still required to complete a remedial investigation and take corrective action and do resamples, because there is really no clear, straightforward way to say, yes, this was made an error. So you still have to conduct the remedial investigation like we discussed.
Am I required to change the beyond use date for all preparations or only for the ones that are compounded in the affected hood?
So this would be for a remedial investigation. If you're doing for an ISO 5 area, say you have 3 different hoods and you want to still continue to use that hood that was affected, you only have to change the beyond use date down to 12 hours for just the affected hood. You wouldn't have to change it to 12 hours for everything. It would just be in that specific hood that was affected by the contamination. That specific hood would need a beyond use date of 12 hours, and the other ones could kind of have your normal beyond use dating.
What am I required to do if the action levels are exceeded in my ISO 7 anti area?
So the ISO 7 anti area, this was an area in the previous rule that you would have had to stop compounding in. if you had a remedial investigation. Now, the regulation specifically says that you only have to do that if it's an ISO 7 buffer area. So you are required to still investigate that out of specification, take corrective action, and then you would you could still resample the area, and then you could still continue compounding with that being out of specification.
I've seen media paddles advertised for surface sampling. Can I use those instead of the plates?
So we don't have any restrictions on what sort of media plates versus paddles that you have to use. So I would just recommend, if you do decide to use those, to go ahead and obtain that certificate of analysis and do kind of a thorough vetting of the media to see, you know, is it too thin? Is it too dry? Is it a big enough surface area for what you're doing? And just kind of do that assessment to decide if that is something that would work for your pharmacy.
Can you briefly review the differences between in-use time and beyond use time? So I assume they mean beyond
Yeah,
use date.
so beyond use date is the date that you are signing your final compounded product or preparation. So the compounded preparation that is going out the door, leaving, being dispensed to a patient. That is what you would assign a beyond use date to. Beyond use dates are typically determined based off stability and microbial considerations. The in-use time, however, is just the amount of time that you can use a specific product, usually a conventionally manufactured product, for compounding processes only. So it's never leaving the pharmacy, it's staying there, and you're using that vial to make multiple preparations for multiple different patients. So that vial can't just be used forever. So you have to assign what we call an in-use time to it. And that is what we're talking about. The in-use time is you can't just use it forever. And that in-use time is usually determined based upon if there's preservative or not in that vial. So the in-use time is limited to those which we talked about earlier.
I'm not 100% sure if I understand this question. They're asking for retail multi-dose vials with preservatives such as testosterone. If a vial is good for 28 days, how do we dispense Rx and end up extending past that? Wouldn't that cause wasting? The first thing I would tell you is what Katie talked about today is the sterile compounding rule. This rule does not apply if you're talking about just dispensing a manufacturer's vial to a patient. So when they use the word retail, I'm assuming they're talking about retail dispensing. So that 28 days does not apply to the pharmacy. It only applies to a pharmacy using it in compounding. So I'm not sure if I answered that question. I'm not sure I understand the question. For surface sampling for risk level 3 every 30 days, do you have to do the ISO 8 also, or just the 5 and 7 areas?
So you are required to take a surface sample in every single ISO classified area every 30 days. So you would have the ISO 8, ISO 7, and the ISO 5 would all be sampled monthly.
Since the in-use concept isn't in current or proposed 797, will the board consider removing that restriction?
That'll be something that the board will probably discuss once the proposed revisions are made final. It isn't anything that they've discussed yet, so that'll all be taken under consideration at a later date.
And the board has made a decision that once 797 becomes final, they will go back and look at our rule and see if they want to make any revisions to match 797. Is the affected area considered the whole room to retest or just the spot that was tested?
So it kind of depends on, it's probably just the spot that was tested. So it's, say for example, you're testing an ISO 7 room and you've taken 7 different samples within that room. If the spot by the door is the one that failed, that's the spot that would need to be resampled.
Well, the participants have access to the slides today. If you're asking about handouts, they're posted on the board's website, and we did email them out if you signed up before yesterday. If you're actually talking about our program itself, you'd have to email us, and let's see about if we can get you a copy of that. But the slides, a handout of the slides is on the board's website. What about sampling contact plates for personnel? Any recommendations for this?
So the board's regulations don't really require any sampling for personnel. We don't require glove fingertip sampling at this time. That's not to say it isn't recommended, and it's still a good question. You can use either of the media that I mentioned earlier, so the triptych soy agar, and then you can typically you want a bigger surface area generally to be able to collect that sample in.
Is the ISO 7 remedial investigation, in the ISO 7 remedial investigation period, does the sporicidal need to be sterile, or is non-sterile acceptable?
So our regulations don't require sterile cleaning agents, so you could use either.
If we have results exceeding 797 action levels in ISO 7,
I can read it.
you read our.
Yeah, we had some technical difficulties, so I'm going to take over reading the question. If we have results exceeding USP 797 action levels in ISO 7, and we are mixing a 5FU home infusion pump that's given over 46 hours, if we are assigning a beyond use date of 12 hours, can we still dispense if the administration begins within 12 hours? The answer is yes to that, because the beyond use date, again, is just the amount of time until administration begins. So as long as you get that pump to the patient before the 12 hours is up and they start administration, you're good there.
Someone's saying the action level reference are from 797. Do we, if it changed in proposed 797, do we expect to change our rule? It goes back to what Katie said earlier. Once 797 is finalized, the board will review, but until they make any official changes, you would have to follow our rule, even if on that. Even if they're different, until we change our rule. My hood is located in a segregated area of our pharmacy. How should I do environmental air sampling?
So the environmental air sampling, you'll really only have one area to sample, and that would be your hood, which is the ISO 5 area. So you would have to do the volumetric air sampling every 6 months, and then, yeah, if you're risk level 1, that would be your minimum requirement.
Can a sterile product be used within 1 hour, that will be used within 1 hour, be prepared aseptically outside of an ISO 5-7 area?
No, because our regulation will require any sterile product has to be prepared in an ISO 5 area. Yeah, so the answer would be no.
Someone's asking for clarification again on monthly surface sampling for ISO 5, 7, and 8 areas.
Yes, that is for risk level 3 pharmacies only. So risk level 3 pharmacies are required to do monthly surface sampling, and it has to be done in all ISO classified areas. So depending upon the layout of your pharmacy and what that looks like, you would have to take some in your ISO 8 area, some in your ISO 7, and some in your ISO 5 areas, and that would be on a monthly basis for the surface sampling.
And for risk level 1 and 2, it is?
For risk level 1 and 2, risk level 1 is just air sampling every 6 months, and then risk level 2 is air and surface sampling every 6 months in all ISO classified areas again.
Okay, well, we're running out of time. We didn't get to all the questions today. If you have questions, you could email Katie directly if you had a question for her. At this time, I'll just give you an update. On October 3rd, I'll be doing a webinar updating you on the pharmacist immunization and administration rules and statutes. We had changes both statute and in regulations in the last some go effect at the end of this month. So October 3rd at noon. Watch email alerts. Actually, we already sent one out. We'll be sending another one out shortly on how to register for that webinar. In order to get CE, you must complete the post-webinar survey. Do not close your browser when I say that the webinar has ended. A screen will show up. You need to click close on that little window. Again, don't close your browser, and then a survey should immediately open up. It has some questions for you to answer, and then click submit. If you do not get the survey after the webinar, you can email us at compliance@pr.mo.gov, and we will email you the questions. You must have your answers back within 24 hours if you want CE credit, and we will mail certificates for today's program in approximately 30 days. Again, we do record all our webinars, and they're posted on our website. It can take up to 30 days before that happens. So I am now going to close the webinar.